Good morning. Can I welcome members, invited guests and the public, both here and watching, hopefully, on the webcast, to today's meeting of the Regeneration Committee. Members of the public may like to follow us on Twitter at London Assembly and take part in the meeting discussion using the hashtag Assembly Regeneration and hashtag Housing Zones. Our main topic of discussion is the GLA's Housing Zones programme, but first a few short formal items, please. Please make sure your electronic devices are off. I'll switch mine off when AM Gavron arrives, just in case she phones. Apologies. So we've got...
we have apologies from Assembly Member Arbour and Assembly Member Hall is substituting for him today. And as you just mentioned, Chairman, Assembly Member Gavron is running a little bit late, and also Assembly Member Dr Sahota is going to be here but is also running late.
Thank you very much. Can I ask the committee to note the recommendations set out in item 2, please?
Noted.
Thank you. And can I ask members to declare any other disclosable pecuniary interest and other relevant interests, please?
None.
None? Okay, thank you, none. And can I confirm the minutes of our meeting held on the 5th of September, please?
Agreed, Chair.
Thank you very much. Summary list of actions. Can we note the completed and closed actions arising from previous meetings of the committee, please? Noted. Thank you. And now we're moving on to the main business. May I welcome each of our guests from left to right. David Lunts of the Home GLA team, Jamie Ratcliff, ditto, Andrew Taylor from Countryside. Thank you for coming, Andrew. And Councillor Shama, Tatler and Aktar, Choudhury officer from London Borough of Brent. Thank you very much for coming as well. Can we agree to note the report and discussions of the delegated authority to me? Oh, did we say that at the end? That's the end. Yes, I thought so. Apologies. Exactly. So let's go straight into... I thought we'd start by David and Jamie. Just a lot of the data did arrive a little bit late. So perhaps for up to 5 minutes each, you gentlemen could set out where you think we are in terms of the overall programme for the 30 housing zones, please.
Yeah, if I can start, Chairman. So the Housing Zones programme was launched in 2014. It was a time when we were giving serious thought to what more we might do here at the GLA to support the delivery of housing regeneration and affordable housing. And we were particularly interested in exploring ideas that would do a number of things rather differently from the way that we traditionally perhaps operated. And by that I mean, number one, we were increasingly keen to try and do more to reflect local borough priorities in the work that we were supporting and try and target more of our investment into partnership arrangements on projects that were led by the boroughs and their own sense of local priorities and concerns. And that was very much responding, I think, to feedback from boroughs who felt that there was perhaps a bit more we could do to prioritise our investment alongside their strategic priorities. The second thing I think we were looking to do was to understand how we might use our capital budgets, our investment programme for affordable housing more flexibly. I think, to simplify a little, traditional affordable housing grant allocations are made in a very relatively straightforward way, and increasingly it seemed to us there were opportunities to unlock schemes and deliver more homes in ways where, if you like, the funding fitted the project rather than the project always having to fit the funding rules. So the second point really was this need for perhaps more flexibility to unlock schemes. And as the committee will be aware, there are many opportunities in London that are quite complex and do require a bit more flexibility and longer term thinking. So those were two really important priorities. And I think we were also drawing very much on the experience of the time of the beginnings of setting up New Development Corporation in London, Old Oak Common, and some of the work that had been going on in the Homes and Communities Agency before it transferred into the GLA. I think the third thing to say about the programme, beyond the local priorities and the flexible funding, was that I think we were also responding very much to feedback from partners, whether they were commercial house builders and developers, whether they were housing associations. There was increasingly, I think, a view that if we could use our investment more flexibly, they would be able to bring more to the party. And that was important. And then finally, I would add that another dimension to this that was very interesting for us was the idea that rather than allocating virtually all of our money into grant funding, we might look to allocate rather more of it into recoverable investments, either loans or recoverable grants or partnership or equity arrangements. So in other words, was there more that we could do in these longer term, more flexible arrangements where we would invest, we would see results on the ground, and then we would get some money back that we could reinvest in more affordable housing going forward. So those were the reasons why we undertook the Housing Zones programme. I would say that it was a very innovative programme in its day. We hadn't really done anything like this before, and neither had it been tried nationally, although shortly after we launched the programme, government adopted a very similar approach and launched their own Housing Zones programme. I think it's fair to say that although the programme overall is still on track to deliver the ambitions and the targets that we set, which, as you will appreciate, were quite not just ambitious but also quite long term, and that's maybe another thing worth adding into the mix. Actually, this was always seen as a long-term 10-year type strategy.
Do you just want to say a little bit about the targets for those listening?
Yeah, so the Housing Zones programme came together in a series of stages. Initially, we allocated £200 million of capital into the programme when we launched it in 2014. Government then showed interest and match funded that with another 200 million of recoverable investment. So we, if you like, doubled our money, 200 of ours and 200 from government. And then we allocated at the beginning of 2016 another 200 million. So over the space of 18 months, we took a £200 million programme up to a £600 million programme. And that meant that we were able to adopt an overall target of 75,000 new homes over the 10-year period of housing zones. And we eventually set up a programme with 30 housing zones in the programme. So that's the scale of the programme in terms of numbers, time trajectory, and the number of homes that we're looking to deliver. I think it did take some time to get some of those housing zones up and running. It was a new programme. It required fresh thinking. There was a lot more complication, if you like, in terms of legal agreements, contracts and transactions that had to be navigated. That was a challenge sometimes for us, if I'm honest. I think we stepped up well, but it did require us to do things differently. It was certainly a challenge for some of the boroughs. And the very nature of the sort of schemes that we're talking about, complex brownfield projects, nearly all of them did require quite a lot of capability, quite a lot of appraisal, quite a lot of due diligence, quite a lot of contractual documentation and so forth. We did, as you know, have a review. In fact, I think it's reasonable to say we probably had sort of 2 reviews along the stages since we launched in 2014. One was a review very much focused on borough partners to get feedback from them about their experience of working with us on the programme. The other was a more internal review, which the new administration launched shortly after arriving in 2016, because the Mayor was keen to understand more about the Housing Zones programme, the extent to which we wanted to continue to commit to it, and in particular, what could be done to increase the levels of affordable housing and the pace in the programme. I think we've learnt from both of those, and we can talk more about those during the course of the meeting. I'm sure we will. We've certainly streamlined our processes and made things a lot more efficient and user-friendly in response to the feedback from boroughs. And we have certainly, I think, gone a long way to increasing the pace of the programme by pushing partners to get into contracted positions. and also increase the level of affordable housing in the programme, which now, I think, as a programme as a whole, is at 43% affordable housing within those within our contracted targets.
Thank you. Jamie, do you want to add anything at this stage?
Yeah, I think just a few other things I'd weave in to add to the narrative and kind of my reflections on where we've got to is I think there's something at first of is this still a programme in terms of housing zones, and we're managing it as such, kind of with an internal board and group that looks at it and that manages the approvals consistently. But in reality, the programme was more about how people applied for funding and kind of the sense of competition against each other while we were going through a contracting process. This is now really a series of different 40-odd different intervention contracts that, because it was very flexible in terms of how we did it, are being managed differently according to the different circumstances. And I think some of that is why pulling together the information for you in a different way was slightly challenging for us, and we had to be iteratively asking different teams to do it. I think there's something being very clear about the overall target that we've got, the 75,000, that quite a lot of that are what we call indirect homes, so not part of a contract that we've got with a funding with a third party. So just over a quarter, we have a contract where there's an organisation that is committed to delivering those homes in return for our funding. The remainder are intended to be enabled by our wider actions. I think kind of you might want to quiz us on that, but I think we can legitimately claim that some of those wider actions are definitely having a good impact. And Alperton, I think the team have said, is one of the best examples of that, where we've done a lot of brokering with the landowner, with the borough and the delivery organisation that's coming in to get what was a pretty challenging scheme into a place where it's now got a planning approval and hopefully will move forward into delivery. I think there's something that needs to be recognised quite carefully around the over-programming. So we made a lot of allocations, particularly against the 400 million grant budget. It was £986 million of approval in the end. So always there was going to be £586 million of funding requests that we thought were sensible that were going to be knocked back. And it did take us quite a long time to get through the contracting. And we kind of expected, as we pushed things a bit harder, that some of that would naturally drop away or be picked up in other ways. It didn't for quite some time, and it was really only last January where we set a very clear deadline that things need to be in a place where we can contract by then, that we actually stripped away a lot of that over-programming. And some of that funding asks has moved to different programmes, and some of it is being looked at in different ways by our partners. I think just the final thing I was going to say before leaving it for you to take different questions, just thinking of kind of a clear success and clear challenges. I was reflecting this morning that when we launched the programme, I remember sitting in a briefing with Rick Blakeway, then Deputy Mayor for Housing, and former Assembly Member Qureshi was challenging us around Meridian Water, saying this has been around for a very long time. Is this programme really going to be the answer to unlocking it? And I think the answer so far is not yet. There's been a lot of work put into it. It didn't get any funding from the Housing Zones programme, but we are now working proactively with Enfield, who have a clear vision for what they want to do. There's been various challenges with that along the way, but this wasn't the answer, but hopefully kind of our new ways of working now will be. A clearer success, I think, is just picking up David's point around the loan programme. This was the first programme of loans of recoverable investment that the GLA had undertaken. Previously, government felt that they either legally couldn't or didn't particularly trust us to run those programmes on their behalf. Government had found it pretty hard to allocate that funding. We did very well. We contracted the full 200 million pretty rapidly of that recoverable funding, whereas it was taking us a lot longer with the grant funding. The disappointing part of that, though, I think, is we had quite a straightforward request with government to allow us to recycle that funding, and we've got a repayment schedule with them, which we'd committed to, and we could basically have recycled £150 million whilst meeting all our obligations to them and timing and returning money, basically net neutral impact for them and us being able to deliver more homes. We haven't been able to agree that to date, and I think they're somewhat distracted at the moment, so probably there aren't prospects for doing so in the near future.
Okay, thank you. We'd normally now go into questions that people watching at home would say that those are the logical questions, but because AM Gavron's not here yet and she's keen to be involved in that, we're going to, if you like, go to the case studies first, so move to Andrew and then the Brent team. So Andrew, did you want to say just a little bit about your programmes, I believe, in terms of Hounslow and Rainham and Bean Park, and then we'll ask those questions first, please.
Thank you very much. Yes, so just for your benefit, Countryside Properties is a housing developer focusing on regeneration, estate regeneration within London, and then wider, larger scale developments outside London. So we are involved in a 11 year.
Okay, these questions are for you, Andrew. What has been the impact of having a housing zone? If it wasn't a housing zone, what would have been the, or put it another way, the fact that there was a housing zone, how has this helped you to deliver those housing and that development? So
if we go back to Hounslow, the direct outcome is an increase in the amount of affordable housing that's being provided, an additional 10% in relation to the scheme. So that is a tangible outcome of the scheme. The flip side is actually we've got less market housing to sell. So actually, again, that gives us the confidence to continue. We don't exactly know what, the market is good. We don't know exactly what's going to happen in terms of the future, in terms of the market. But having that de-risking of the scheme, because there's more that's going to the housing association involved, it allows us to continue with confidence into the next few phases. So there's a couple elements of that. There's a direct outcome in terms of the increase in affordable housing, but there's also the comfort, the de-risking of the scheme to be able to take that forward. And as I said, also the ability to work in partnership with the council and the GLA to iron out any other problems as they come up. That soft side of the partnership is really key as well. And on Bean Park, as I said, while we're not getting the funding directly, releasing the station or creating the station, delivering the station, will be the catalyst for the regeneration of that area. Without that station coming forward, the ability for us to deliver 3,000 houses and the next site 3,000 houses and I think 800 at the other side of the road, that confidence may not be there. It's providing that confidence. So yes, we're investing in there. We've got an easy access into London or central London for work and the ability to move around easily. And that then provides the catalyst for us to say, yes, we can come forward and we can invest, we can bring forward the commercial early in terms of those phases. We know there'll be footfall to that area to go to the station. So it provides us with that certainty to take things forward.
So you would say this is a successful programme?
It's been a very successful programme. And I think, we talked about some of the change in terms of the flexibility, and that is key for us. The ability certainly on Bean Park, got planning permission on site, actually you can then increase and change things through the process. It's not about saying, well, you've got to apply at a certain date and you can't apply after that. So having the flexibility to change things, mid-development and respond to things as they come up, from our perspective is fantastic, because you never know exactly what's going to happen. What happens today will be different to obviously what happens in 6 months, and the ability to change and respond to that is great to ensure the programme and the delivery and the schemes keep moving forward.
Okay. And did working within the housing zone programmes and given the engagement you've had with the GLA affect your approach to regeneration and policy making?
In terms of the wider GLA?
Yes.
Yeah. I think we are focused on delivering regeneration in terms of the communities and working with those communities, whether that's the borough level, the actual local level or the GLA. So I think that policy, the relation to the housing zones and bringing those forward, it understands that there is a reality to life, that sometimes you need to put some cash into something to change something, to deliver something. And when you're talking about a large-scale regeneration of an area, there are going to be issues that come up right at the start or throughout the life of that project. So the council, the GLA and the councils collectively together understanding that those issues, and there's a certain pragmatism in it, and people have got to be realistic to deliver things. The market by itself won't necessarily always deliver everything, and there is therefore the need to have that partnership working things. So yes, that policy assumption is great in terms of moving things forward and be able to have, from our perspective, have that confidence to invest and move forward with the developments.
So these housing zones do deliver more houses, and certainly more affordable houses, but they also help you to regenerate the area, because it isn't always just about housing, it's also about putting communities together. Okay? And does this, being a housing zone, does it help you to do that any better?
Well, yes, if I use the Bean Park as an example, without that station, without that point and the hub that will create that community, it'll be very difficult to get that centre going. So if you have 3,000 houses with no community provision and no retail units and no commercial space, it won't be successful. Well, it's not really a community, is it? It's how people live, but there's not actually any activity, there's not any engagement, there's not any interaction between those community. So, yes, the funding is there and actually helps to provide that focus that can create that community as part of it. But again, it's not just about the funding, it's not just about the developers, it's actually about getting people together and outside. So one of the things we do in a lot of our projects is actually that community-focused work to ensure that we're getting people on the ground, people actually interacting with each other. So part of that is about activities you put on, part of that is about the community facilities that are provided. But if you have a hub that's key to the whole site, that's a fantastic opportunity to be able to actually work or use that as a basis to work on.
Okay. I mean, on your scheme, on the large scheme you're talking about, are you the only developer there, or are there other developers involved in that scheme too?
We're the only developer on the 3,000 units of Bean Park, but in the wider... So within the wider housing zone, yes, there are other developers involved as part of the wider housing zone. So it is broader than just our site.
So does this help the other developers to collaborate, or does it encourage that sort of behaviour?
Yes. Obviously, there is...
Because I'm thinking of developing in the south, for example. There's a lot of developers there. There's a housing zone in south, right? And I sometimes get the impression that there isn't that coordination, and that's what I'm really concerned about.
I think you've got a fundamental difficulty, if you like, that if you have lots and lots of organisations involved, it will obviously be more complicated to coordinate things. Having said that, the Bean Park housing zone, Rain and Bean Park housing zone, without the station coming forward as a coordinating thing in terms of the timing, you're not going to get all the other investment that's surrounding that area. So yes, you've got that as a nucleus. Therefore, everyone is going to be interested in terms of when that's coming forward, the key critical points, so that they know when they're investing in their sites. So in that sense, that really helps in terms of coordination between different parties. But it's then the informal discussions with the GLA, the boroughs and the other developers that ensure that you can work together. But yes, it is difficult because you will always have competing aims and competing aspirations, and that's just, I suppose, a fact of life and different organisations being involved. But if you have investment in infrastructure that's then going to deliver on a certain timescale, that helps to bring people together.
Great, thank you.
So can I ask the difficult question then, Andrew, from your point of view? You've looked at all these schemes to some extent over the years, or not all, probably most of the 30, and you bid some, you don't bid others. When you fed back, I'm sure you had to feed back to Jamie and David at some stage. You've given all the good things of the housing zone. Is there anything that you would have changed, or you hope that they are now changing in terms of, because obviously some of them have made great progress, let's be blunt, and some of them haven't actually made any progress at all?
I think the ones we're on have made fantastic.
Well, but I want you to answer the latter bit, sorry. You should be a politician if you answer like that.
It's obviously difficult to talk about the schemes we haven't been involved in, and I don't really want to do that.
Yeah.
But we are at the start of a process on Cambridge Road in Kingston, as an example, and we know there'll be challenges moving forward. The first challenge we've got to focus on is in relation to the ballot, in terms of bringing people on board. And yes, that comes as part of the funding from GLA in terms of that, and we understand that, and that's part of the commitment. But it's a risk, from our perspective, in terms of moving things forward. I completely understand the importance of bringing the community along, and that's what I was talking about in terms of community engagement, especially when you're having to move people around in terms of existing residents and finding new places to go. And there's an awful lot of focus on making sure they only have to move once, and making sure they understand and they're not getting anything that's they're effectively being bettered as part of the scheme. But that is a risk from our perspective in terms of a developer, in terms of investing up front, and then you've got a ballot as part of that process. But the simplistic approach in terms of bidding, talking process in terms of funding, the ability to do things, that's all great. So I haven't got any concerns in relation to that part.
Okay. Just to warn you, when AM Gavron arrives, she'll probably ask you the same question, so I'll let you come back if I could. Navin wants to come in.
Yes, Andrew, you have given some good examples of some of the regeneration aspects of the project, and your approach to that is also very welcome. My question is, what would you say is the sort of whole package in terms of regeneration elements, e.g., let's say, social infrastructure? You mentioned community facilities. What are they actually? You mentioned school, which is replacement or redevelopment of the existing school. So that's great. But are there other facilities like, say, you're developing 2,000 plus in the end sort of homes, and like you said, this is about creating communities, and they don't and they can't live in isolation. So have you also got in community facilities provision, for example, for health facilities and whatever else you have? And essentially, when would this be delivered? And is there adequate funding for what your aspirations are, or what is part of your plan?
Fine. Well, on the Hounslow site, it's a much smaller scheme. It's only 240 odd units. So actually, in that, it's the residential, and it's the school that's being delivered there. And on Beam Park, obviously, it's much larger at 3,000 homes.
There's the one I was.
And on that one, you have the ability, therefore, to provide a whole host of community benefits. And if I read these out rather than talk,
please do.
And then you'll get the idea. So we've mentioned the railway station, which is obviously not directly us. So 2 primary schools, a nursery, parkland and open space, a medical centre, gym, swimming pool, a mixed-use community space, so a community hall or provision, and then a community and multi-faith space. So there's quite a lot of that provision in terms of meeting rooms, buildings that you can hire and use throughout the day and throughout, obviously, the evenings and weekends as part of that. But then the schools, the medical facilities and the gym, and then on top of that, obviously, retail units as well. And to answer the first question, yes, it's all part of the package in terms of the provision, in terms of financing that's coming forward as part of the scheme. And the bulk, because it's around the station, are coming forward as part of phase 1. So yes, that's the commitment. So in phase 1, there's 640 houses, 1 primary school, nursery, food store, medical centre, and the pharmacy, as well as the cycle parking spaces and all the other things that you'd expect to go with it. And then the other school is obviously coming on later in the phase, as and when it's required. So yes, I entirely agree with you. It's not just about housing, it's about the wider community provision and the spaces. It's about thinking about where they need to go. So if you're creating the hub around the station, that's the place to put the community facilities and a lot of the retail space. But you also need to think that actually 3,000 houses or 3,000 homes, there's a lot of extra land that, as you build out, actually you need to have the provision across the whole site as well. So then you've got primary facilities and nursery school coming later on, so that people don't have to walk as far to utilise those facilities.
So you can give a complete assurance to the community to start with, people in Hounslow, and this committee that that package that you just talked about will be delivered, and it's not subject to any vagaries of viability.
No, I mean, this is, that's all being dealt with as part of the legal agreement, as part of the planning application, the legal agreement as part of that, and obviously, yes, the additional funding that's coming in from the housing zone.
Yeah.
And it's yes, that's the part of that package.
Yeah. Thank you. That's good to hear. Chair has pretty much covered. I'll just ask, from your experience to date, you said all great and good things about the project and the works of. What have been the key barriers, lessons to be learnt, both from local authority perspective and indeed from the GLA, so that this project benefits, and particularly the rest of the program benefits as well from what you've done so far and the barriers that you have faced?
Yeah. I think, you know, we have to be realistic about the cross-boundary working between different boroughs and in different aspirations, and we have to be realistic about that and ensure that we have, you know, a good understanding across the three different, you know, I'm talking about Bean Park, but you've got three different authorities there in terms of the GLA, you've got and two London boroughs. So being realistic about that and about the aspirations and different aspirations from different people. And, you know, being open, that's what I was saying about talking and being open about things. That's a key thing from our perspective. We have to be able to talk. We have to be able to speak to those key decision makers in those bodies to be able to understand and have that confidence. So that's a key thing, which is not necessarily directly about the housing zone, but it's part of that process about ensuring you can have the confidence to bring forward the development. That's a key thing. The flexibility. You know, the change and improvements that have been discussed, but the flexibility of the scheme to be able to have a light touch, to be able to go in and have changes and have discussions and being flexible to be able to respond to whether that's the economy or whether that's a new infrastructure demand that's come up. That's a key thing to ensure that the programmes continue to move forward and to continue to deliver the communities that are needed.
Thank you.
Okay.
Yes, I'm interested in this thing about the medical centre. I often see on plans medical centres, but how do you deliver that? Because that delivery depends on the NHS. I can understand primary schools, they're delivered by the local authorities and they were connected to schemes. But the NHS sits quite outside. So how do you translate that piece of land or building designated as medical centre into a clear medical centre?
It can be challenging, being realistic about it. So medical centre is not necessarily just the doctors, it can have a wider, obviously, provision as well. And I mentioned the pharmacy as part of it, you know, so you can be wider than just a medical centre. You have to
But the core of that will have to be medical care.
Exactly. And therefore you have to get the NHS to sign up to that provision. So it's not a local doctor's surgery, it's the NHS has to sign up to commit to the provision of that health facility. So we will provide it, we will build it, we will, you know, kit it all out, we'll, you know, ready to hand the key over, but actually you need a signature on a bit of paper from the NHS to do that. And it's a long process to go through and work with the NHS to ensure you know, we've obviously experienced across the country of doing similar things. In itself, they're viable entities by themselves because they pay a commercial rent. So actually, it's not that but it's the running cost from the NHS perspective that's key. So that's another thing about working with the, you know, in partnership with the boroughs and the GLA. So well, actually, collectively, we need to have those discussions with NHS. This is a housing zone. This is a key redevelopment area. It's, you know, I don't know what it is, 9,000 houses or so within this zone, and actually that's key to ensuring. A medical centre is key to ensuring the community is there and has the facilities as necessary. But it's also about the NHS being committed to when they bring forward that medical provision. They're not going to bring it forward when the first home is opened because there isn't the demand. So it's understanding when and when it ramps up, when that demand is there as the schemes get bigger and bigger and as other developments in the surrounding area get bigger. But yes, it is another process to go through, another signature that's needed to ensure we can deliver the building, but we can't staff it.
Yeah. I mean, you say that I mean, the pressure on the nearby practices who will be there, who are already stretched, will start as soon as you deliver Zone 1 ride. Yeah. And the tragedy with the NHS is that it also lags behind the demand. Yeah. And the only reason I'm raising this matter is not because I'm holding you responsible as a developer, but merely is to put it on the public domain ride, that the NHS does lag behind housing development, and we see a huge rise in housing development, and the practices who are already struggling even more before there's any help coming available to those patients.
No, I agree, and it's the same with pharmacies as well. You can't need to get a pharmacy licence, and they don't generally give a pharmacy licence out unless there's enough housing to support that. But you obviously haven't built the housing yet to get the licence, so you've got that strong circle. But just picking up on the comment earlier, from our perspective, we need to create early on a successful place and a successful community to be able to sell houses and bring people in. So if we want the facilities there early, we want the primary school, we want the medical facility and the community facility, because that helps to create that character and that sense of place to want people to buy into this, you know, when we're selling the houses or when the affordable housing comes up for options.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. We're going to move away from the micro and back to the macro to get David and Jamie to give us an overall view of the 30 housing zones. And Naveen's going to kick off and then welcome Nikki Gavron.
David, is regeneration one of the key objectives of housing zone delivery and the whole programme?
Very much so, yes. And I think, again, going back to my earlier comments at the beginning, this was very much in the minds, of all the borough partners that we work with to bring the projects forward. Yes, delivering more housing at pace was crucial for us, but so too were the wider regeneration benefits, some of which we've been discussing in the last few questions. So that's very much why the funding that we've been able to offer through the programme's flexibility has not only been geared towards affordable housing, but also very much towards infrastructure of one sort or another. So, we have helped to fund public realm works, we have helped to fund bridges, we have helped to fund schools, and the kind of infrastructure that's very much associated with regeneration. And the scale of most of the housing zones, I think we've had a sense of that from Andrew's remarks, in the main are about projects which are of a strategic nature. Some of them, as we've heard, are many thousands of homes. It is simply not possible, let alone desirable, to take those sorts of projects forward without seeing the wider regeneration issues that have to be incorporated. So, yes, very much so. Regeneration was always at the heart of this, as well as the headline housing targets.
Yeah, and your point is absolutely right. That you got a number of housing zone projects which sit within opportunity or intensification areas and so on. But the concern I would have, where you're developing large number of units which are away from the sort of town centre and those kind of amenities. And that's where, within criteria, that there's sensitivity and plan to make sure that you're not just building, say, 500 or 1,000 units or 2,000 units, say, suburban areas away from kind of urban development there. That they are not simply housing units, that there's element of mixed development as well. Is that part of the plan?
Yes, it is. And again, as we've heard, on some of those really big locational opportunities where you are starting with very large sites, one of the advantages of the programme, I think, has been that it's given the confidence. It's helped to de-risk some of the cash flow and need for capital up front. And sometimes we've been able to directly fund elements of infrastructure. And that's helped to improve the viability of projects, which has meant that developers like Andrew have been able to come in and address some of those other needs beyond just the housing units. I would add, though, that most of the housing zones, I think, if one goes through them, I'm not sure that the Bean Park example is completely typical. Bean Park is, one of the very largest brownfield sites in London, and obviously it sits in quite an interesting area, sandwiched between, a residential area and a very industrial area. So I think some of the challenges around infrastructure and community facilities there are greater than they are in many of the other housing zones, which are often either in existing town centres or places that are already reasonably well supported with shops, with schools, with facilities. I don't want to downplay the challenges that we've talked about, that there tends to be a kind of lag on things like school provision and health provision, but most of the housing zones are operating within bits of London that are about regeneration, but are not necessarily about vast brownfield sites with relatively little infrastructure to support them.
Is there also a good working partnership and sort of sustainability of projects in terms of working with other agencies like TfL, where you are developing large projects where connectivity is critical And therefore, if public transport infrastructure, for example, isn't good, is this something also part of the plan to make sure that, that there's good public transport, whether it's bus or other access is right to serve those large communities?
Yes, indeed. And it's a very interesting question, actually. It's a very appropriate question because one of the objectives, really, one of the factors that we wanted to incorporate into the Housing Zones programme was the ability for the GLA to escalate issues that needed escalation, because many of these projects require cross-agency working, and as you rightly say, in particular to maybe organise and coordinate a better interface with agencies in the mayoral family, particularly TfL. To be honest with you, I think we've already kind of asked some questions about, you know, what is the learning in the programme, and what are some of the difficulties or occasional frustrations and challenges in the programme. I think it hasn't always been as straightforward as we would have liked to have all of the agencies as well coordinated as they could be. I think we've done a pretty good job of organising the coordination across the mayoral group. But if it comes to public transport, for instance, it's not always so straightforward to deal with agencies like Network Rail or the train operating companies. And that is an ongoing issue in regard to projects like Meridian Water.
Yeah, I mean, that is the biggest concerns, that whilst we need, given housing crisis, etc., large number of housing, economic, jobs and so on, but whether we are actually providing enough infrastructure in time for those projects to become viable, sustainable. But okay, so okay. Another big concern I haven't had, unfortunately, time, is the paper coming too late, which gives you data on the whole program, which I think came through yesterday. But the impression I get, and that's my big concern, is that there are sites which were formerly for industrial use or other uses, etc., being allocated for housing zone, so you got change of use. So the question is, are we developing housing zones at the cost of other vital uses, or is this being balanced by, you know, having those uses transferred over within the area, or almost like land swap, whether that's possible or not? So are housing zones being done at the cost of other uses, land uses?
No, I don't think so. I mean, all of the housing zones are being brought forward in projects that have to be compliant with London Plan policy, and of course, it's the London Plan that sets land use at a strategic level and balances the competing demands for land. So, and as we know, I mean, I guess the headline from the London Plan, as much as anything else, is the need for more housing. So that is a principal objective here. But all of the sites that we're talking about are sites that have been designated for housing or mixed-use development. It is true to say that within some of the very large site housing zones, there is still a requirement to have some level of strategic employment land. So, for instance, again, Meridian Water is a good example of that, where a lot of the land has been redesignated for housing purposes, but a portion of the site is still reserved as strategic industrial land, and that will be protected. But I think one of the things that the programme is hopefully looking to achieve, coming back to what's perhaps been a dominant theme in the discussion this morning, is not just, you know, stacking more and more housing onto sites at the expense of other things. This is very much a programme that is geared towards trying to, you know, create thriving neighbourhoods where, you know, it's not just about dormitory communities, it's very much about people being able to live, work, recreate, enjoy themselves within regenerated parts of London. So, you know, we do not want to create, you know, some sort of suburban commuter model of housing zone. That's the furthest thing from our minds.
Thank you. If I move on to a specific question I have in front of me here, how effective is your tracking of the development of the new homes you directly fund?
Yeah, so in terms of the direct funding, I think it's very effective. In terms of the affordable housing, we log it through the same way that we manage our other affordable housing programmes, through our open project system, and in order to access any tranche of funding, the partners have to log it on that system, having met a number of requirements in the contract. They can only do that in accordance with having a set of documentation that they need to hold, and that's audited on a sample basis afterwards. In terms of where it's not affordable housing, it's a slightly different process, but basically we rely on the partners logging the claim with us in accordance with the contract, and there's a set of things that they go through. It's just slightly different administration. So I think that's very clear and robust and happens in real time, and we publish the outturn of that on a quarterly basis as part of the GLA affordable housing statistics. The indirect homes is trickier and with a greater lag, so we rely on the London Development Database to record that, and that's got approximately a 4-month lag at the end of each year. So depending on where you are, there can be quite a long lag. So what's happened in April of this financial year, we won't know until August.
Our mixed-use developments, what we've been talking about, some aspects connected with regen, are they part of your tracking?
So we're not, the key outputs that we're monitoring are in relation to housing starts and completions. That the other things are part of the programme, and some of them we're directly funding, like bridges, but we're not monitoring outputs in terms of the other things that are being delivered. They're part of the planning application and part of the individual contracts.
But surely, those elements of mixed use are key to regeneration, key to success of these new neighbourhoods which we are developing. Should we not be intelligently looking at tracking those as well, so that to make sure that you deliver all key aspects of your project, your programme?
Yeah, I think that's a fair challenge that you might want to make to us. I guess a lot of that will be a requirement of the planning permission, so you wouldn't be able to legally claim our funding for housing unless you're operating in accordance with your planning permission, and that's something that's obviously checked and monitored by the local planning authority. And so I guess there's a balance in terms of the amount of compliance and obligations we place upon our partners, and certainly the red tape from the GLA was one of the things which came out quite strongly from when we engaged with boroughs, versus being able to prove that places are successful and they're delivering those outcomes. And yet your committee might well have a view on that, and that's something that needs to be balanced.
Yeah, I mean, I accept your argument that delivery is connected with planning conditions and various legal agreements, etc. But given the kind of leadership role, key role that GLA plays, I thought that in order to deliver this project successfully, tracking should also include those other key aspects, something you want to take back as part of what you do and feed that into your review process. Yeah. If we can move on to next question, and that is...
Before you do, I think Susan had a point on that
Susan,
question.
Yeah, will you please forgive me, because I am subbing on this committee, so I never sit on it, so there's so much I don't know. It's horrifying. But do you keep a track of all the houses that have been built, the ones that have been granted, and know exactly where you are and publish that?
So the slightly tricky thing here is the distinction between the direct, what we call direct homes, which are the ones that we've got in contract, and so we know in real time what's happening in terms of starts and completions of that, and we publish it on a quarterly basis, and that's available on the website, compared to what we call indirect, which are basically the other homes which are happening within the housing zone, and those we only pick up through planning data, and that we don't currently publish it, although everyone can have access to the London Development Database, and the shape files of the housing zones are on that, so you can look at it. And again, that might be something that you say that you'd like to see us do on a more regular basis, but on an annual basis we could publish the total homes within a housing zone, but a quarterly basis we do already publish the directly contracted ones.
Okay, so me, who's brand new to this, anybody watching who doesn't know, if I look at your 30 housing zones, I can look at it and I know that the Heart of Harrow is gone nowhere. I look at the Edmonton Futures and Meriden Water, and I don't think they've gone anywhere either. I haven't even looked at any of the others. So where would I go this afternoon when I've finished here to look up to see exactly how many homes have been finished, how many are in progress, and how many are going through their planning permission?
If you Google GLA affordable housing stats, it will take you straight to a page on the GLA website where it will list the number of starts and completions by year, by programme and by borough. And so that would then show you, and so at the end of the last quarter, there were 1,883 of the direct homes had started.
Direct those
or
three
indirect?
particular
Direct.
projects, I think AM Halls particularly after, those three particular projects, what would you find there?
So that's a fair challenge. It doesn't list it by individual project, it lists it by borough. And so most boroughs only have one housing zone, so that would be quite obvious. But for those that have two, then it wouldn't be quite so clear.
Could you make it clearer? Because if you live near, I don't know, Edmonton, Futures, or that's in the same borough thing as Enfield, isn't it? Then at least they would know. Also, lots of people don't think about boroughs, they just know little areas. So that might be helpful to know where we are on each one of these zones.
Yeah, so that's certainly possible. It's information we collected for the committee. It's very easy for us to pull together, and we could look at publishing that in different places.
Okay, thank you.
Naveen?
Yeah, David, directly to you, please. You mentioned 2 reviews of housing zones. The first one, I believe, was pre-2016, which you said was about the borough partners. And then then there was obviously 2016 review, which you said was internal review. And at 28th of November Housing Committee meeting, you said about this review that there is not some sort of big secret report somewhere. Yeah? Now, okay, you may not have a formal report that it's not secret, but can we plead from this committee to have a clear summary, clear key sort of landmarks or, the sort of findings of the reports that you mentioned, so that we have access to that, everyone has access to that, and are able to monitor and scrutinize the role that we have.
Yes. I mean, it is the case that we never set out to, undertake a large-scale, review that we would publish. That was never the intention. It wasn't done that way because we wanted to hide anything. There's nothing that we've said today that, we're not happy to share. But it was a review very much focused initially, as you say, on feedback from the boroughs. Then what can we do to really nail down the programme and make sure that the contracted housing zones are in a position to really get going, and can we do more to increase the levels of affordable housing, which of course the new administration was most interested in. I see no reason at all why we can't let you have a note on the main findings from that, which I'm happy to provide, that can take you through the outcomes of that, those 2 processes and the responses that we made as a consequence. I'm happy to arrange for a note to be shared with the committee.
For now and for clarity and on record, can you or are you able to set out the full scope and purpose of the 2016 review? And what did you learn about how the program was developing, and what changes were made as a result of the review?
Again, I mean, I'm happy to let you have a note on that. Yes.
I mean, to cut to the chase. Can I just
jump in?
Yeah, please go ahead.
So I think it's kind of, I think 2 things need to be borne in mind of this. Is one is kind of the review. Part of it was a process, which was basically how do you deliver more affordable housing, and we got from a place of a third of where the allocations were to about 45% now. of what's directly contracted. Another part was learning from the borough feedback, and we've shared a copy of the document that we gave to boroughs with the committee. And so I think we're perfectly happy to provide more information, but probably just a dialogue on what else it is you want beyond that borough document and the outcome, which was moving from a third to 45%. And I'm happy to talk through the summaries of the borough outcome if you want me to do that now.
I think that would be useful, and also I think I don't know what the findings were in terms of affordable units, for example, but the impression I have is that a large number of them were kind of locked in. This is pre-2016 to something around 30% or 35%, and obviously the intention and given Mayor's kind of direction as far as genuine affordable housing is concerned was to go as much as towards 50% allocation. So whether you know what your findings are on that as well, where we are on that, and indeed the issue about regeneration elements, whether review did undertake any of those aspects as well. So if we can have a kind of key headlines.
Yeah. I'm very happy
review,
to write to you
please.
on that. Very happy to do that.
Okay.
But just cutting to the chase, and I know that I'm not trying to get a soundbite because this is not going to be on the front page of the news of the world. Let's be blunt. But the reality is it's about leadership, isn't it? And it's borough level leadership, particularly when you go through this list from top to bottom. We all know the boroughs that really do drive whatever they're doing, be it regeneration or adult social care reforms, and those without embarrassing anybody that don't. And the projects that haven't gone very far, I mean, I remember going to see one of them 8 years ago with a Noah hat on, and they've just launched an ODU very, very briefly. Nothing much has happened. How do you encourage the boroughs that are perhaps are less dynamic than the ones we have here today to get on with it, David?
Yeah, it's a fair question, I think. And I think I would obviously commend London Borough of Brent and the London Borough of Hounslow as being two, and Barking and Dagenham and Havering, of course, who have been very helpful. I think we've seen real progress. I think that there certainly is an issue about capacity in some boroughs. That's perhaps not surprising. As we've said, these are complicated projects. You know, most boroughs have had to, absorb major cuts in resources in recent years. One of the learnings that we took from the review with the boroughs was the fact that, there was quite a lot of capital finance in the programme, but no real revenue finance, and that's something that we addressed. We allocated £600,000 for boroughs to draw on to help them with revenue support to try and generate some of that expertise. I think the other thing I'd say, though, in fairness, is that I think there are a number of reasons why some of the housing zones have struggled really to make much progress. And I think it's often to do with other factors than just local kind of leadership, actually. I think if you look at the ones that have struggled, sometimes it's to do with land acquisition. By and large, the housing zones where land ownership is quite straightforward, and particularly if that land's in the public sector, things have tended to move more quickly. Others are more complicated, they might need CPOs, and that's obviously very time consuming. I think the other factor in this as well, which has perhaps dragged one or two zones backwards, or at least not allowed them to move as quickly as we would like, is just the sheer sort of scale of capital investment and risk that's involved. And certainly if you look at a housing zone like Meridian Water, I think to be fair to Enfield Council, I think they really have stepped up to the plate. They've invested very heavily in land acquisition there. But as they found and we found, the developer that they procured was reluctant to actually move ahead, given the sheer weight of capital that was going to have to be spent up front. And also something else we've discussed, and again I think Enfield Meridian Water is a good example, that project is very reliant on major funding decisions from transport agencies that we don't directly control. So I think there are a range of factors, to be fair. I wouldn't want people to leave here thinking that the reason some housing zones have struggle to get as far as others is always down to local capacity and leadership. There are other issues too.
Okay, very briefly, Susan, and then we're going to
Very briefly, to give me a clue, out of the 30 zones, how many haven't got a brick started for properties? How many of them haven't actually started building?
When you come back and answer that during the process, Jamie can dig that out, and we'll just move. Navi's got a very quick question, and then...
Yeah, Jamie, I'm not sure. I've got this schedule here, which is program data for Regen Committee. It says there's reg ratings in here.
Is it, sorry?
Reg ratings.
Yeah, reg rating, yeah.
Which is useful. Can we have with that kind of, which will be useful column alongside as to why projects which are particularly, say, not moving or haven't moved at all, what are the factors for the amber or red light zones which are earmarked here? I think that would be a useful way of finding out what is holding back those programs. And we can then have that kind of monitored and updated.
Yeah, so we could definitely provide commentary on the red and amber. It is worth just flagging that that is ratings of each intervention that we've got contracted, so it doesn't cover the zones where we haven't got anything that's contracted.
Yeah.
And so coming back to Assemblymember Hall's question, that I think there's 4 zones where there's nothing that started either across both the direct and indirect categories, which Edmonton Futures, Meridian Water, New Bermondsey, and yeah, no, that's it. 'Cause, and there's a couple in our indirect numbers that we have not split out across because the planning data is showing them both at the same time, so there could be a couple more. I'm also slightly suspicious about the LDD data for Morden Town Centre that says 1 home has started, and so that's where I would count maybe 4 when nothing's happened.
Well, and what about the Heart of Harrow?
So Heart of Harrow, there have been indirect homes. So Heart of Harrow, 1,456 indirect starts.
Not on that, on the what's...
On the rag sheet, the other one.
So on the rag sheet, this was something that I sent over to Rena, I think on Tuesday. So this summarises all of the LDD data.
Yeah,
and on the one that I'm looking at, unless it's transposed, it says 1,456.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, and I think Nikki has a whole series of questions she's been keen to get in.
No, most of the questions have been asked, actually. But just one that isn't on here, which is just listening to this. Is it then the boroughs that are largely coordinating? It's going back to something you were saying a bit earlier, David, about when in answer to Navin, about how you make sure that all the different elements of a housing zone are actually properly coordinated. So who is actually doing that?
So the responsibility for the delivery of the housing zones does rest with the boroughs. You know, they're the contracted parties. So they're primarily responsible. The exception to that is the loan finance, the financial transactions, the recoverable money, if you like, the government money mainly,
Sure.
Which has to be transacted with private sector partners. But if you like, the overarching strategic contractual obligation to deliver the zone and the targets and the obligations that sit within it do sit with the boroughs. Now, that doesn't mean that we are, always completely passive and just sit back and, look at the numbers. Yeah. We're usually quite heavily engaged, either because there's a need for us to assist with coordination and bringing others to the party, sometimes because we've been in a position to, almost literally sit alongside borough teams. I've got colleagues that are seconded into various boroughs part-time to offer support, but primarily the responsibility does rest with the individual boroughs.
And I think that's
and the monitoring?
Sorry?
And the monitoring then is a split between the GLA and the boroughs?
Well, in effect, yeah, because they're obviously reporting back to us. We keep everything at project and programme level, but we rely on the information that comes back from them.
Okay.
I was just going to say that I think not as part of the review, but definitely a lesson that we've learned in looking at our more proactive engagement in land of how we get our teams culturally to take a greater involvement and play a more proactive role. And there's kind of, historically as grant givers, it's more about we give you a contract for it and we'll monitor it and what are you doing, and if it slips we'll tell you off. Whereas to make this work, I think the best zones have been where we've been in lockstep together, and so as part of the more proactive approach, we definitely want to change that culture and have our
that's
teams
what I wanted to hear.
getting out there, being more proactive. And I think it's not just that in terms of championing the project, but it's also in finding opportunities. So housing zones were all proposed by boroughs, whereas there are definitely other areas where we can find opportunities, and also places where other partners, whether that's developers or housing associations, could propose our engagement. And we need to do much more across the whole of London, so we can't just rely on one set of partners or another.
Interesting. Okay, thanks. Now, you keep mentioning indirect homes. Can you tell me a bit about the numbers of indirect homes and the pace of the delivery?
Yeah, so the numbers is 75,000, which was 50,000, which was the quite round number that we came up under the previous mayor for the first round of it. We then put in another 200 million, so we thought it should go up to 75. The current indirect expected numbers are 76, so we're just over that in terms of the profile.
Sorry, hang on a minute. So 75,000 homes in total?
Yeah, 75,000 homes of all tenures to start within the housing
Direct
zone.
and indirect?
Yeah.
Funded?
Yeah. And some of the housing zones are quite big, and some of them are quite tight. Some of them are like pockets and islands. I think if you look at where we are, in terms of the number of indirect homes that have started, it looks like a fantastic story in that there's nearly 26,000 total homes that have started across those zones in the 3 years to March 2018. And if that trajectory just continued, and I think in reality we'd expect it to accelerate, because as you can see there's a number of large sites where little has happened, it would be close to 100,000. But I think your follow-up question might be, hand on heart, can I say that that success and fantastic rate is entirely down to housing zones? I don't think we can. There are definitely zones where our support and coordination has helped things happen beyond our money, and we heard a bit about that from Andrew. But there are others where there's probably market homes that were going to happen anyway, and how you distinguish between that, I'm not sure.
Yes, okay. So wait a minute. How many do you expect then to have by 2022? Indirect homes done? Cause
indirect.
Indirect.
So...
Because you just gave me the starts, which were looking very promising over those 3 years. So how many do you think will have you completed by 2022?
So I haven't got a clear profile in front of me of either completions or starts of indirect, because basically we're monitoring them from London Development Database. We could kind of apply some lagging indicator to the starts to come up with an idea of what completions would look like. We have also got planning approvals, which you could apply some kind of discounted lag to get to expected starts. We did have profiles at the beginning from boroughs of what they expected the indirect to be, but it's fair to say quite a lot has changed in that time, not least because 586 million of the direct allocations we haven't been able to make because of the over-programming, and lots of other things have changed in the meantime.
So do you have a ballpark figure for completions by 2022?
Not with me at the moment. We could apply a calculation, but some of them will be on sites that there hasn't been direct involvement in terms of the housing zone. They just happen to be within the red line, and there's going to be other things which will come forward or not come forward between now and 2022. Okay,
but you've got a figure for completions of affordable housing by 2022 on these sites.
For the direct, we've got
the direct
for the direct homes, we've got precise dates of when things will start and complete, and contracts which hold partners to that as a condition of the funding. The indirect are not tied down in that way.
Right. Okay. It's complicated then. So you don't have a handle really on that.
So we have a handle, albeit lagging quite a lot, because we get it from the London Development Database on what's actually happened. But in terms of looking forward, it's pretty hard.
Sorry, can I jump in there, Jamie? Because you certainly, the way that the Mayor is clearly understanding that you need to deliver a lot of homes by 2022, you have a overall figure. And surely you must have broken it down in terms of all the new programmes you've started, the TfL programme being probably the biggest. So you must have at least a rough idea how many of those are coming through from this original programme. You know, plus or minus 10% at least. Please, please tell me you do have a figure, because otherwise, how can we believe the overall figure?
So the 116,000 is starts by 2022 is based upon what partners log on our systems, and so therefore is based on real homes that they're directly delivering. And so of that, there's a proportion that's in housing zones, which I've got here, but of the indirect, some of them might be being funded through a range of different programmes. Some of them will be on TfL land, other mayoral land. But we haven't got a breakdown of the overall indirect number from housing zones, because it will also include a range of infill sites, a range of other sites within them.
So it's 16. 116. Oh,
This is the overall.
116.
Can I just jump in? Because just to be clear, I mean, we're talking about, I think, at least 3 different things if we're not careful, and we might get a bit confused.
Yeah, I'm getting confused.
The 116,000 is the number of affordable housing starts that the Mayor is pledged to deliver by the end of March 22 across London, not just a housing zones programme. Starts. And that is a programme that we control, and a target and a set of trajectories that we have. So that is our programme. We take full responsibility for that. Separately to that, there is an element of direct homes within the housing zones programme, which we have contracted with boroughs to see delivered, and we monitor that very carefully. The third bit, though, is what Jamie's talking about, is the indirect. So the bulk of the homes that make up the full 75,000 target for housing zones are a whole range of consequences of our initial catalytic investment to unlock schemes. And we are on track, and we are confident that we will deliver that overall number. But what we don't have is a detailed sort of targeted trajectory year by year for the indirect delivery, because as Jamie describes, that is consequential to all sorts of factors that are way beyond our control.
That's understood, David, but do you have an idiot-proof slide? You must have, for other politicians in this building more senior than us, you must have produced at some stage that you can send to the committee that says those 3 basic categories, just so we have a view of each of them in terms of where we are, and I appreciate the latter one. What we're talking about here, the indirect one, is going to be the least, that maybe the amber figure rather than the green figure, but it'd just be nice to have something nice and clear.
Yeah, I mean, again, we can certainly explore the opportunity. We can explore the potential to have some sort of estimate of how the indirect homes might evolve over a period of time. But I don't want the committee to sort of leave here thinking that we're going to nail ourselves to a trajectory and a set of targets year by year for the indirect delivery. That was never the intention of the programme, and I think it would be. There was, there is no point in setting targets for things that we have no control over.
But we can nail you down to deliver those direct ones as per your targets.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so we're very clear about those. And I think on the indirect, the slightly strange thing is it looks like it will be comfortably exceeded in terms of the run rate of where things are. And we could comfortably exceed it and have a whole load of other problems with the programme, which then means it's not actually a success. Conversely, we could deliver all of the direct and have a great success in terms of the stuff we're involved in, and due to a range of other factors, we could miss that 75,000 and that would actually be a success. And so I think there's just something that I think we need to reflect on, and you will undoubtedly have views of how useful that 75,000 of just all homes that happen to be happening within the red line is. And how confusing it can be.
Would you accept, although I take the view that you probably will succeed in terms of your overall target, my personal view, but several boroughs are going to really underperform. Is that fair?
Yeah, and I think, again, it's worth bearing in mind that, one of the outcomes of the review, which, as I've said, we will write to you about, the internal review was bearing down on boroughs to really get their contracts signed by last January. So we gave them a very clear deadline for that. Some boroughs contracted by then, others didn't. So the removal of the over-programming means that some housing zones now are not receiving mainstream housing zone programme budgets because of the original over-programming and the need to get into contract by January last year.
Sorry,
so
that's the 10 the 10 projects on
yeah,
the right
that's right.
hand side of page 5.
That's right. So to give you an example, I mean, just by way of illustration might help. You know, one of the earliest housing zone opportunities was New Bermondsey in Lewisham, which you know, had an existing planning consent. It had an existing landowner that had assembled most of the site, and you know, we were in a position to effectively front fund a new railway station that would have meant that we could increase the affordable housing, get things moving. Now that project has stalled. Now it's stalled really because of a very controversial CPO and you know, quite a difficult relationship with between the landowner and Millwall Football Club, which, as you may well know, has mired that project. And without a resolution to those issues, and particularly the CPO question, that project can't move forward. So that has no funding at the moment. It's still designated as a housing zone, and we're still working with Lewisham. But that's a good example, really, of where, you know, one very specific issue can just stop a project dead.
Sure. Sorry, Nicky, go ahead.
You were talking a little while ago, David, about not having, you know, don't have control over the indirect housing. But does that mean you surely have influence in some way?
Well, sure, we do. Otherwise, we wouldn't have, I don't think, come up with an overall target for indirect at all.
Yeah.
And so, you know, the overall 75,000 figure wasn't, as Jamie was describing, it wasn't sort of just plucked out the air for convenience. It was the product of a lot of dialogue with the individual boroughs, a lot of assessment about what the upfront investment and the direct homes could genuinely unlock. And as we've just discussed, I think, you know, we think that we will comfortably exceed that. Yeah. But clearly, you know, market conditions, all sorts of other external factors are going to weigh in the balance. So while I think I hear what the committee's asking for, which, if I'm correct, is kind of let's understand very clearly where you do have targets over things that you control and trajectories, but also maybe is there a way to kind of at least kind of paint a picture or a set of scenarios for housing zones more widely beyond those control targets. I do understand what you're looking for, and we can certainly take that away and look to see what we might be able to share that might help to fill in some of that detail.
Okay. Could we move on, and then the committee can think about if there's any final questions for David and Jamie particularly.
Just talk about
but I'm really just keen that we get Brent have been very, very patient over there. So we can give the good news of Brent, Nicky, and then you can come back at the end if we could.
Affordable housing.
Brent have come all this way, and it will be really good to hear where they are. And I know Naveen's really keen to ask them some questions. Do you want to say a few words first to start off with, Councillor?
Yeah, I think just thank you very much for inviting us down here. We're proud to talk about regeneration as a whole as a borough. I think our history and kind of how we approach regeneration is something that we're very proud of, and some of the comments that have been spoken about already in terms of infrastructure is very much that we approach regeneration with parallel to how we make sure infrastructure is in place for residents who are going to be moving into these new schemes, but also people who already live in and around the regeneration scheme. So we have two housing zones in Brent, Wembley and Alperton. Both have opportunities, and we've been very excited to work on both. Both have come with some challenges. The sites themselves are very different. Wembley Housing Zone, there's issues around a former school site and designation from the ESFA, so there's been some delays around that, and that's been directly funded through the GLA. Alperton, most of its former kind of industrial sites, and as mentioned earlier, sort of negotiations with the GLA about how we unlock that with the developer there. But with both of them, we are both anticipating things to be coming forward in the next year. I think the Northfield site in Alperton has already started. Planning permission was given last year. And we've handed out, I think in front of you, is a map of the Alperton area housing zone, and also the two stapled documents are the Wembley housing zone and the plans coming forward for those. Happy to take questions really about them and kind of the challenges and some of the benefits that have come and the things that we've done to make sure that these housing zones are fruitful for both residents coming in to the borough and also the residents who are already there.
Thank you. Naveen, I think you know a bit about this anyway.
Yes, indeed, but we need to dig deep and get the positives and any other challenges. To start with, on Wembley Housing Zone, can you give us an update as to where we are, and also how we are doing in terms of targets? Are we achieving those?
Can I take that? Okay.
So
On Wembley Housing Zone, we've got two principal sites. The housing zone and the GLA funding allowed us to acquire one very critical building to start that process off. And as we stand, we are preparing to put in for planning permission one of the biggest sites, which will in itself deliver over 270, 80 homes. And then the Ujima site is also going through preparation for planning later down the line. The difficult site has been the Ujima house site, because the bigger opportunity relies on acquiring sites from Network Rail, which has not been an easy process. And I think there was a question asked about barriers, and I would rephrase that to what could be the enablers rather than the barriers. And I think on the housing zone, one of the enablers may have been to actually get the public sector landowners together at the outset and say, we want to do this, we'd like you to contribute. We're talking about some backland of Network Rail, which would considerably add to the housing numbers on the Wembley Housing Zone. So in terms of numbers, our target for Wembley Housing Zone started off with 2,300, so that's the contracted number. We are heading for a potential delivery of 2,700, of which 1,300 would be affordable. The other thing is that as a borough, and I think this is true for all boroughs, the contract from the GLA to deliver in the housing zones, the role of coordinating with the various stakeholders, landowners and private developers rests with the boroughs. And because we're sort of leading on this particular one, the development coming forward in the Wembley Housing Zone has got considerable community facilities. And you've got in front of you actually one of the documents which actually just illustrates the point. So we've got some major workspace, affordable workspace coming through, about 4,000 square meters of it. We have two very large community spaces, a very significant public square as part of the Copeland site, plus all the usual other things that you'll see in the development.
I think also I should add, there are schools, secondary schools on either side that we've put into our schools capital programme that we've kind of effectively rebuilt. So that they've been expanded to accommodate the wider growth in Wembley, which I assume a lot of you will know and have probably seen, that to accommodate the influx of families. And it's also contributed to actually rejuvenating Wembley High Road as a town centre.
So the numbers are looking better than what we've actually contracted for. The difficulty that we have is, and David has already mentioned this, is that we also have indirect outputs. Now, in the case of the Wembley Housing Zones, the planning consent for the indirects has already gone through. So that's one of the big developments right next to the Wembley Housing Zone sites that we control, which is going to be developed out. So again, on the indirects, we're looking very positive. Right at the outset, we started, when we drew the boundary for the Wembley Housing Zone, we actually deliberately chose a wide boundary, and that's to capture the indirect outputs. From what is called the Borough Intervention Agreement point of view, the difficulty is, and it's already been mentioned, that we don't really have much control over the indirect outputs, but the Borough Intervention Agreement actually has clauses which says the borough will be accountable for delivering those. So if you like, the liability has been passed to us. But nevertheless, in Wembley Housing Zone, it's a good news story. We're delivering the direct and the indirect. And planning, hopefully, we're expecting submission at the end of March for the big scheme, and we've already got. Which one am I mentioning? 100 million.
So we've already allocated, we were talking about funds, so in the budget pipeline and the capital programme pipeline in Brent, we're allocating 100 million to ensure that we deliver the Wembley housing zone. It's in our capital programme pipeline. So once things move forward, we will be allocating those funds to ensure that the housing zone is delivered and timely, because one of the things that we're very conscious of is that we have all this talk of housing zones and they're brilliant and how great they are to unlocking difficult sites, because this is not an easy site to work with. It's actually making sure that we've got the resources in place to make sure that we can deliver. So David quite rightly mentioned that councils and authorities are strapped and our resources is an issue, but we have actually made a point in Brent to make sure that we're resourcing our housing zones properly. So we actually have a dedicated officer that deals with Wembley housing zone, and she's been dealing with it phenomenally well. Despite the difficulties of the constraints of the various landowners and so on. So we are very keen to make sure that we resource it, because the end goal to deliver everything is actually very important for us. So we do resource it, and so allocation of that capital funds is crucial.
Could I just jump in on Aktar's point that around the indirect, that Wembley is the housing zone with the second most on the stats that we provided you, with 3,184 indirect starts so far. But I think a lot of those, because of that wide boundary, are basically things that Brent had done the hard work with their delivery partners before housing zones even came along.
Yeah.
And
I should also mention that David's point earlier about unlocking our priorities. Wembley and Alperton are two housing zones. We already had strategic plans about what to do with them. So where Wembley had an area action plan already set the year before, and Alperton had a SPD set back in 2011. So this housing zone enabled us to kind of really bring things forward in terms of our priorities to unlock those sites. I think if we go on to Alperton, or do you want to have any more questions on Wembley?
I mean, the next question was on funding, whether the housing zone funding has actually truly helped you to accelerate the program, which already had in terms of broad master plan, and I mean, is that the case?
So Wembley, we received 8 million from the GLA, and it is a contribution, and we won't say no to any kind of money coming forward, but it is a priority for us as a borough. So we will do what's necessary to find funding through our own capital to help deliver it. We understand that GLA has got numerous housing zones across the borough, and there's only a certain pot of money, and we're lucky we're in a position that we can put some money from our own capital to help deliver it. We work with partners that can help deliver things as well. Do you want to add?
Yeah, I think a really key point about the designation of housing zones as opposed to the funding is that the brand value. Yeah. And certainly in Alperton, what it did is it really catalysed private sector attention. Because Alperton is a very large site, industrial site, had all sorts of planning policy issues. And when the housing zone designation was given, the borough took a very, very early step of saying that if we needed to CPO anything within that zone, the resolution was already there. We were talking with the landowner at that time about looking at the Northfield site, and that's now subsequently been purchased, and the planning application has gone through. So it just had a lot of private sector investment coming in and attention coming in because of the brand value of the housing zone. So when some of the housing zones, the 10 that you've got listed there, Alperton is one of those. The funding, if you like, wasn't coming forward. There was already a lot of activity going on. And I think one of the key points for us is to recognise where the whole housing zone programme is across London, and actually just take another review maybe to see, well, which ones have really moved on. And with more public sector injection of funding in the Wembley housing zone, we could accelerate it more, because there are some still critical bits of infrastructure that we need to fund. And that would just allow other sites to come forward as well, because there is attention, but there are key little bits of infrastructure that still needs sorting out.
Are you sort of satisfied that you have adequate funding for that vital infrastructure that you need for these developments?
I wouldn't say no to extra money, ever.
I think that's
yeah, it's a rock and hard place. I think public sector bodies are all strapped and trying to find the ways to inject monies to kind of deliver infrastructure is key, and it's whether we work with NHS or TfL or Network Rail. I think we've got to find innovative ways, and so whether it's using private sector money to inject cash, so our developer on Northfields is putting money in to help upgrade Stonebridge Station, Wembley Housings, and we're putting money in ourselves. So it's difficult. I appreciate it is hard, and we wouldn't say no to extra funds. But
no, I mean the concern I had, I already expressed in one of the question and comments. It's about making sure that infrastructure is sufficient and fit for purpose to absorb, to have large developments.
One of the approaches we've taken, particularly with our planning agreements and legal agreements, is to ensure that infrastructure from the developer is put in the first phase of building. So our Northfield site, for example, will deliver the doctor's surgery, the community centre, large part of the affordable housing, improvements to the station or the walkway to the station, all will come as the first phase of delivery. And the generator building on Northfield as well, we're hoping to get it in the second phase. So all the stuff that's been promised in terms of infrastructure to allow the viability and sustainability of that site, we push for in the legal agreements of our planning agreements to be delivered first. And that's how we ensure that actually there's no tension then between residents who are seeing all this new development, but none of the infrastructure gaps that potentially could arise.
Sorry.
If I may just refer you to the map, I think just to understand the complexity of what we're talking about. The numbers on the map represent site ownerships and the ones that are coming forward. A critical piece of infrastructure there is actually a road that takes us across all the sites. And because of the multiple ownerships, no one developer or owner wants to come forward, and we've got the powers to actually build that link. And for very little money in relative terms, we could provide that, and that would release a number of sites coming forward. So that's sort of an example of...
moving on. And has Brent worked differently with the GLA on these programs compared to other interaction you have with other projects which are outside housing zone? So is this experience any different and better, or where it could be better if it is not the case?
I think it's been a really positive experience with GLA on the housing team and this program. Right from the outset, we set up a board, which was set up by the council, but the key housing officers from the GLA have been on that board. In fact, right after this meeting, I'm going to go to that board in the council. And that's been a very frequent monthly meeting right from the start. So we've had a very, very good working relationship with key officers in the GLA. I can't comment on how that compares to other boroughs because I wouldn't know. But I think it has been a positive, and I think the positive suggestions that have come forward from the GLA and officers in driving this forward has been really productive for us as well. There are, of course, different parts of the GLA, and it goes back to my first point. Sometimes it didn't feel connected that we were having a discussion about bringing forward a industrial site in Alperton, for example, where clearly, we've got some very, very ambitious housing targets, and we still do, and yet it felt like there was an internal sort of discussion and debate going on about whether the industrial site would be de-designated so that we can deliver the site, and actually that could have been a lot easier if that would have been sort of sorted out internally within the GLA itself. So yes, with the housing team, very positive. I think with the other GLA family bodies, TfL in particular as well, we could be better.
You haven't faced particular capacity issues in terms of dealing with this massive program, and whether you've needed and been supported with any specialist issues. I don't know whether CPO, for example, you mentioned, is something where you needed or you could have sort of had, say, support from GLA team. Any such matters?
I mean, that particular example, no, I think GLA have been always has always come forward and said, if you need to do this, we'll be right behind you on that. So I don't think there have been any issues on that front at all, no.
Okay, brilliant. Moving on to social infrastructure, we heard the picture with regards to the Hounslow developments that we've talked about. You already mentioned some of the aspects of social infrastructure, etc. I mean, that is all again part and parcel of planning consents and legal obligations. So you are absolutely sure that those would be delivered?
Yes.
Yeah.
It's how we approach regeneration beyond the housing zones. It's how we approach regeneration in Brent. That we have these conversations with developers, if it's not our own land, to actually say these are the things that we need in order for this application to be supported. We need to have social infrastructure as part of our planning policies. It is something that's really important to us, because we can't go back to residents and say we're improving all this housing, which is great, but there's nothing in terms of improving the road network or the transport networks or health facilities and so on. In Kilburn, for example, I know it's slightly outside, or it's outside the housing zones, but we're delivering schools, a medical centre, civic hub, community centre, and that's our led project. So we insist that what we tell developers, we will deliver ourselves as well.
My last question is most critical, hasn't emerged so far, and that is about experience of local community, or communities, both residential as well as business, traders, etc. How have existing communities locally have responded to, in this instance, housing zone development, and particularly have what you've been trying to propose, has that proved to be very controversial? What level of engagement you had with the community, and are you delivering what fits in with community aspirations? So I think this is very crucial, because it is about people, whatever we do.
Yeah. And I think our work on the original Wembley Area Action Plan kind of cemented residents about what they were going to expect to see coming through in Wembley. And in Wembley, residents are very, I think now 10 years down the line, are very used to kind of regeneration and what that meant. I think the initial conversations were always going to be difficult, because change and kind of how we communicate has to get, could have been, you can always communicate better. I think the big controversial, the kind of thing that was, I think, worried residents was the issue of the school, particularly in the Wembley housing zone, and what was happening to the playing fields, what was going to happen to the actual school site. Once we rebuilt the school next door, I think that all those fears were alleviated. I think with Alberton, it's different. It's because it's predominantly industrial sites. There were no residents really to engage with within the actual sites. But what the developers have done on our insistence is have a real community engagement process with residents who live slightly beyond the sites that they're developing, and that's proven really, really well, a really good thing. The Northfield sites in particular, they engage now with the local school, with residents, and they've set up a community program to help them deliver the community centre, and there'll be a board of trustees that's set up from the community themselves. So there's been a lot of work on community engagement. I think the difficulty with businesses' engagement, the housing designations were brilliant for us in terms of delivering our intention and showing our intentions to the industry about what we want to deliver in terms of housing. One of the effects of the housing zone, unfortunately, has been a result in loss, through permitted development, a loss of office space through permitted development.
PD rights.
Yeah, PD. And in Wembley particularly, we've had a huge number of offices and businesses displaced because of PD, and landowners kind of heightening their expectations on the land value or the value of their site. We've now issued an Article 4 for the Alpes in Wembley and widely any growth area in Brent to make sure that we can stop that, because actually we still need to retain the business community and small businesses within the areas. We don't want to displace them. And also we want developers to come to us through planning permission and through our planning process rather than go through permitted development. So yes, they're the two things. But I think community engagement has been long and intensive, and I think residents are very much aware of how regeneration works in Brent, so they're very used to it.
Okay. Thank you. I'm done, Chair.
Okay, we're going to try and wrap up in the next 10 minutes. So, Susan.
Right, this is really quick. I mean, my biggest concern, if you look at Harrow and Wembley, is that it's served by Northwick Park Hospital, which is already at absolute capacity. I hear that you say you're building doctors' surgeries. Do we know that there are doctors that will be able to take a practice into there? I spoke to the chief executive or the acting chief executive of Harrow, and his biggest concern is that the whole medical issue with these massive developments. Are you is anybody talking to the Department of Health, etc.? Because, I mean, I trust that the schools are dealt with because the councils will think about that. But I think we've got a major problem with health provision with all these extra people.
Possible for the wider members of the community to understand what you send. I think all I have to say now is, can I ask the committee to note the recommendations set out at the end of this discussion? Noted.
Yep.
And we've done the minutes of the meeting held bit. And can we note the completed and closed actions arising from previous meetings? Done that. So I'm no further urgent. The next meeting I should read out is Wednesday the 6th of March at 2 o'clock. And we agreed the programme going on with the deputy chair, etc. as usual. No other urgent business, so I can close the meeting. Thank you.